Hi, my name is Nanako Shirai. I'm a rising senior in the mold department, and this summer I did a research project and internship with Professor Amy Borovoy of the East Asian Studies Department, looking into kidney transplantation in Japan and around the world. So because my internship was centered around kidney transplantation, I wanted to give a brief background on what the kidney is. The kidneys are bean-shaped organs on both sides of your body, about the size of a fist. Their main job is to filter blood and remove waste and maintain electrolytes. And then they also help turn this waste into urine. So the kidney is an important organ for the body, and one of the main diseases it could cause is called chronic kidney disease, and it's a progressive disease where the kidney becomes damaged over time, and this eventually leads to kidney failure. 15% of US adults are estimated to have CKD according to the CDC, and it's also very prevalent in adults above 65. The treatment varies depending on the stage of the disease. So, how are severe uh, stages and cases of CKD treated? They're treated using dialysis or organ transplant. And dialysis is where you use a machine to filter your blood externally. So this is an example on the right hand side of this is a picture of a dialysis machine. And then the other option is an organ transplant. And this is possible because although able-bodied people have two kidneys on either side of their body, you can really just live with one kidney. And this means that you can have both deceased donors, which is where organs typically come from, and also living donors. So you can extract one kidney from a living person and transplant it into another person. CKD that require dialysis or organ transplantation are called end-stage renal disease. And again, this is prevalent in adults above 65. And one of the hard things is that these treatments are expensive. So looking at how countries treat patients with ESRD provides insight on the resources that a society commits to prolonging life. As I said in the beginning of this presentation, the focus of this project was on Japan, and that's because Japan has the oldest population in the world. More of its population is susceptible to developing ESRD. According to the Population Reference Bureau, as you can see on the right-hand side, Japan is at the top in terms of the largest percentage of population above 65 years old. It has a staggering amount of 28.2% of the population being older than 65. So the aim of my project was to take a closer look at the data on kidney transplantation in Japan to understand how aging populations impact treatment availability and government assistance. So the first thing to try to understand is the current situation. This infographic was published by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and you can see here on the left-hand side the number of patients per 100,000 people undergoing dialysis, which is one treatment, and then on the right-hand side the kidney transplant, which is the other treatment for end-stage renal disease. So both are treatments for end-stage renal disease, but the red arrows here show where Japan is in reference to other countries. So Japan is at the very top when it comes to the number of dialysis treatments that it does. On the other hand, when it comes to kidney transplants, it's at the very bottom of this chart. And while these two treatments are available, it's actually better to provide kidney transplants because kidney dialysis requires a patient to stay in the hospital and is actually more expensive. And while this huge gap between the number of patients undergoing dialysis and having a kidney transplant is specific to Japan, there is globally a shortage of organs that can be used for organ transplantation. So in 2008, in response to the WHO resolution, there was a summit on organ trafficking and transplant tourism held in Istanbul, Turkey. The WHO also has guiding principles, but the key terms surrounding organ transplantation were not well defined. So at the summit, they created the DOI, which defined the key terms surrounding organ transplantation and created centralized, non-binding guidelines. And one of the main things that they actually proposed is that governments try to increase the number of deceased donors to try to maximize potential and decrease the burden or pressure to donate on living donors. In other words, they wanted the governments and countries to pursue self-sufficiency or being able to meet your own transplant needs of that country. And while it's not clear if it's a direct consequence, there was a change in the legislation in Japan after this declaration. In 2010, there was an amendment on the legislation that made donations from brain donors possible even without the donor's consent. So until then, you needed written consent from both the donor and the family from brain dead donors in order to get the organ in another person. However, with this amendment, it made it possible for families to decide whether the deceased person would be a person who would want their organs to be donated. And you can see the effect of this legislation from this infographic, which was published by the Japanese Society of Transplantation. So the red here is after 2010, and then before is in the blue. And you can see that there is an increased number of brain dead donors after this legislation. So Japan was effectively able to increase the number of deceased donors. However, my project wanted to, look into this distinction between deceased and living donors more by creating a centralized database. So I basically took data from all these different sources and compiled it into this database. And this is one of the first graphs that I made. The yellow is the organs donated from the living donors, while the blue are the organs donated from the deceased donors. And this is comparing Japan and the United States in 2018. But you can see even just from a glance, the ratios are very different. And I wanted to better understand whether the number of deceased donors is abnormally low in Japan or whether the number of living donors is abnormally high. So I actually went back and looked at the number of surgeries and standardized it to the total population in the country. And so I calculated the number of living donors surgeries performed per million people, and I looked at whether the number of surgeries performed by the Japan and the US were vastly different. And based on the graph here, they aren't too different. The US is near the max, and Japan is in the top 25 percentile. In other words, both countries, compared to other countries, have a relatively high number of living donors. But when you look closer, you find that the details are slightly different. In Japan, the living donations mostly come from spouses and parents, while in the US, a lot of the donations come from a lot of the organ donations come from non-biological donations. I wasn't able to do further research on why this difference existed, but this would be a great question for further research. Going back to the graph, so this doesn't really explain why there are so many more living donor surgeries in Japan compared to the US. So I also looked at the same ratio, but with deceased donor surgeries. So the number of deceased donor surgeries per million people in the population. And when you look at this, you find that the graph is very different in terms of where Japan and the US lie. So US is up here, it's a high outlier. Where there's almost 71.63 deceased donor surgeries per million people in the population, while Japan is at the very low end of the spectrum. It has 1.9 surgeries per a million people in the population. And I feel like this is kind of what the Declaration of Istanbul was trying to get at when it mentioned that you want to try to increase to maximize the potential. So what Japan has the potential to do actually is to try to increase the number of deceased donors. And this is actually something that the Japan Organ Transplant Network, which is the network used when registering to get an organ, has been working on. So the Japan Organ Transplant Network has been doing a lot through the Green Ribbon campaign, where they call upon people to think about organ donation and talk to family about their decisions, especially since the legislation allows for your family to decide whether your organs will be donated if something happens to you. They've also been working on educating younger generations through websites like this website here. I hope you can see my mouse. And then also through videos. They also have this really cute mascot here. So this is from the end of one of the videos published by the Japanese Society for Transplantation, and it calls upon students to decide whether they want to donate their organs when they're 15, which is the youngest age. And also, this is on the right-hand side is a pamphlet published by the Japanese Ministry of Health, made in conjunction with the Japan Network for Transplantation. And one of the pages says, think, talk. which is up here on the green. Sorry, it's covered by my video. But what it essentially says is in the red part is when it's unclear whether the deceased patient wanted to donate their organs, the family will end up deciding. Discuss what you want to do with your family. Any choice is valid. So by calling upon people to talk and discuss with family, the Japanese Organ Transplantation Network is also able to educate older generations about organ transplantation and encourage them to make a decision. Overall, the network really emphasizes that any decision is okay. This is from a video of a boy who was born with a chronic kidney disease, and at the end of the video was the following catchphrase: Yes でもいい、No でもいい、あなたの意思表現を待っている人がいます。It can be yes or no. Someone is waiting for your decision. Through these campaigns, the Japanese government and organ transplantation network appears to be working to meet the transplant needs of Japan by educating more people on the process and encouraging them to make a decision about whether they want to donate or not. There's a lot of research that can still be done, but I wanted to thank Professor Amy Boroboy for her help throughout this internship, and for the Center of Health and Wellbeing for funding this internship and giving me the opportunity to continue to learn remotely. Thank you.